All right, Saagar, what's on your radar?
Well, I got my first dose of Moderna vaccine over the weekend on the same day that nearly 1.1% of the entire U.S. population got their respective shots. It was a triumph of American ingenuity that we were able to respond so quickly, and it has led to an overwhelming ether in the air. As the weather gets better and more people get vaccinated, we can soon on the horizon move on from this terrible year. But a gnawing question will always remain. Where did coronavirus come from? It's a monumental question. While yes, the virus does not have borders, yes, in terms of pandemic management, where it comes from really is kind of immaterial, it really is still one of the great questions of our time. Coronavirus shut down the global economy for a year. It unleashed unprecedented social strife across the United States and the world. It redefined geopolitics for years to come and killed millions, which is why a free and independent inquiry into the origins matters so much. We can't allow this to happen again. Nobody thinks that this was intentional. If it was natural, then let's get to the bottom of it and make sure that we take measures to stop it. And if it was in fact leaked from a lab in China, then it is incumbent upon the Chinese government to answer questions and on the United States government to ensure our population is protected. And yet, since the very beginning of this virus, that latter entirely plausible explanation for the origins of the virus has been completely dismissed. The World Health Organization beclowned itself from the very beginning, going out of its way to lick the boots of the Chinese to ensure that they maintain some access there. But among the chief villains in this story is the media, which after Trump and many of his officials floated that theory nearly a year ago, decided that even entertaining the idea of the lab leak itself would validate something Trump said, and therefore invented an entire narrative about how blaming China for the release of this pandemic is racism. And after a year of posturing among everyone, someone with knowledge is actually speaking out in an extraordinary interview. Former CDC Director Robert Redfield, who served as director of that organization from 2018 until January 20th, told CNN's Sanjay Gupta in a special on coronavirus he believes the virus originated from the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
If I was to guess, this virus started transmitting somewhere in September, October in Wuhan.
September, October.
That's my own view. It's an only opinion. I'm allowed to have opinions now. I am of the point of view that I still think the most likely etiology of this pathogen in Wuhan was from a laboratory. Escaped. Other people don't believe that. That's fine. Science will eventually figure it out. It's not unusual for respiratory pathogens that are being worked on in a laboratory to infect a laboratory worker.
These are two significant things to say, Dr. Redfield.
And that's not implying any intentionality. It's my opinion. All right? But I am a virologist. I have spent my life in virology. I do not believe this somehow came from a bat to a human. And at that moment in time, the virus that came to the human became one of the most infectious viruses that we know in humanity for human-to-human transmission.
That is an extraordinary claim. Dr. Redfield is careful there to say it's just his opinion, but he's someone who would know. Regardless, his statement is important, not only in terms of adding to the public domain of information, but the second part. Nobody believes the Chinese intentionally unleashed this on their own people and on the world. It has always been preposterous to conflate blaming the Chinese Communist Party and the nation of China to actual Chinese American citizens. That conflation, by the way, is the greatest gift that the CCP that you could ever give them. But what followed after that interview is exactly what we've seen over the last year. Either people completely ignored it, or they worked overtime to attack. The chief attack dog, as always, is the New York Times, who for months has now asserted in its newspaper that the idea that the coronavirus leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology is a, quote, debunked conspiracy theory. They have never offered any evidence to that effect. They simply state it as fact. And in their story on the incident, that's exactly what they did. Ex-CDC director favors debunked COVID-19 origin theory. They crowd proudly. Their evidence is that the intelligence community has no evidence that the virus did emerge from the Wuhan lab, which is a complete lie. If you look at the intelligence community statement, they say, quote, the IC will continue to rigorously examine emerging info and intel to determine if the outbreak was the result of an accident at a lab in Wuhan. The other thing they cite is the World Health Organization, who said in February, quote, "It is extremely unlikely that the virus was released from the Wuhan lab." But there's just a tiny problem. Of course, the WHO are basically Chinese puppets who can't be trusted. But more so, their inquiry itself is useless by their own admission. The WHO's inquiry is partnered with the Chinese government, who selected 17 Chinese researchers to help them assist. In terms of other researchers, the government is allowed to veto foreign experts. The investigators also, quote, "won't be able to publish findings without official Chinese concurrence." And the WHO openly acknowledges they were denied access to records in China and, quote, "did not investigate laboratories in China." Cool. So the report itself has to be stamped approved by the Chinese Communist Party, and to boot, didn't even visit the lab in question. Do you see how much all of a farce this is? So much so, it's not just people like on the internet like me talking about this. Major U.S. virologists who actually care about the science have spoken out against the WHO inquiry, pointing out several holes and calling for a real investigation. I have zero doubt a real investigation will ever come to pass. But what I do know is this. It is not a debunked theory that coronavirus escaped from a Chinese virology lab, no matter how much the media may want you to think otherwise. It is a legitimate question and a form of scientific inquiry, and the effort to erase possible Chinese complicity is a direct effort by our media to cover for our main geopolitical rival, all in the name of a fake racialized narrative, and ultimately to hurt the mean orange man, Donald Trump. Do not be gaslit into thinking otherwise. And Crystal, shortly after I wrote this, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, Joe Biden's Secretary of State, came out and said that they have significant concerns around the WHO's forthcoming report on the Chinese lab leak theory. The Biden Secretary of State. Not only that, the Biden State Department has confirmed several of the other corroborating evidence around the lab leak theory. Not to say that any of it is true, only that the evidence that was put forth as contributing to a hypothesis and evidence that it may have come from the lab is itself underlying facts that they found within the U.S. government. Now we have the former CDC director, and 60 Minutes did an entire special on this last night where they asked the chief WHO investigator, who himself has financial ties to China, an American citizen, and he said, and they said, "So you're just going to take his word for it?" He goes, "Well, what else are we supposed to do?" So that, just so people know who the person is who's investigating all of this.
I mean, and it's not like the idea to escape from the lab. So the idea that the Chinese government intentionally released it, which is something that people on the fringe of the right wing were flirting with.
People said that in April, and it's wrong.
That was crazy,
it's
right?
Wrong.
But the idea that it escaped from, I mean, to me, that's Occam's razor. That's actually the simplest explanation, which I think is what Dr. Redfield was kind of getting at there. It's far less likely that it evolved from a bat and then was so easy to spread amongst humans that it transmitted, just wildly, instantaneously. That doesn't mean that that's, Occam's razor doesn't mean that it's necessarily true, but it also means that that theory and that explanation is not crazy at all. It's one of these things where, again, because of Trump and the way that he takes things too far,
of course,
that it caused the media and all liberals to basically go, well, it has to be in the total opposite direction. But even this idea that the notion that it escaped from the lab created a sense of xenophobia and racism. Well, I actually think that the bat explanation created a lot more racism.
Right.
Remember in the beginning, it was all
bat
this like,
oh
my God, Chinese people eat really weird stuff and they're gross. I mean, to me, that was actually much more damaging from a racism and racial perspective than the idea that they were investigating this in a lab and it accidentally infected someone and got out into the population. I mean, none of these things are great, but we need to know the truth of what actually happened without some sort of political agenda behind it. And then on the WHO, remember early in the pandemic when that, that interview? And started getting asked tough questions about Taiwan and just pretended like they couldn't hear the question and then ended the interview. The idea that they're fully independent and just conducting an investigation in best of faith is insane. And this is the type of thing liberals really fall for, because they just have this like undying, unquestioning faith in these multilateral global institutions. And sometimes these institutions are good, and sometimes they do good things, and sometimes they're not. And sometimes they're corrupted by a lot of the same factors that we recognize here in the US that corrupt the institutions here. So this just completely unquestioning faith in the World Health Organization is wildly misplaced.
No, that's right. And already, what have we seen? Dr. Redfield, moments after making that statement, he's a current health advisor to Governor Hogan in Maryland. Liberals are saying that he must be removed for advocating the racist theory that the lab leak hypothesis is true. Already, he's being advocated for openly stating his opinion. The former CDC director for putting that forward.
How is that racist? I just literally don't understand that.
Exactly. Well, they want to gaslight. This is the greatest gift that the Chinese Communist Party could ever receive, to conflate being Chinese with being a member of the Chinese Communist Party. They want you to think that. That's what they've been hammering home in their population for decades. And American largely elite liberals and leftists are the ones who are falling for all of this, because they want to go into like this false narrative. Now, look, is Trump and Pompeo, did they recklessly put this forward in March and April? Yeah. And a lot of people, do you know why they want this to be true? Because it absolves the American government of its many failures. We have 560,000 Americans dead. You can't forgive that, okay? Nothing about whether it came from a Chinese lab or not, people here made horrible failures.
Yeah.
And nobody's saying otherwise. The question is this: did it come from the lab or not? And by the way, there's even evidence that the U.S. was involved in terms of funding something called gain-of-function research, which is something that was outlawed here in the U.S. And maybe we were even involved in terms of getting our data and more from that. It's not a blame game. More what it is this is a terrible example of how the media and the Times is becoming a willing accomplice, really, of a CCP propaganda effort. They want nothing more than for the Times and more to write this. And I saw Ben Smith, who, generally, I'm a fan sometimes, and he was saying, well, I think the proper tag is no evidence. But show me one headline that says Chinese coronavirus naturally came from zoonotics, that says without evidence, people claim that coronavirus came. Because if there's no evidence on the lab leak theory, then there's no evidence on the other side. Guess which one gets the debunked no evidence tag?
The one
and
that
I think that's a disgrace.
Trump affiliated with himself with.
There you go.
That's the one.
All right. Looking forward to your radar next, Crystal.